we've got a really important, interesting question to throw out and ask our panelists to address. And it really is the question of, are leaders born? Do you come into the world with some innate traits and characteristics that make you an excellent leader? Or is leadership something that's primarily refined and developed and taught and trained over the course of one's education and career? So that's the question. We have some really interesting perspectives among our panelists. The format will be, we'll have each panelist go ahead and offer a few minutes of introductory comment and thought about this question and this tension. Then we'll go ahead and transition to question and answer. And so make sure as we go along you're making notes and thinking about things that intrigue or frustrate or concern and interest you, and we'll make sure that we have time for questions. There are microphones on both sides, so as we get to the Q&A time, go ahead and make your way up, and we'll have some good exchange among the panelists. My plan will be to go ahead and introduce each panelist just before he or she makes introductory comments. I'm not going to cover their whole bio. It's in your program, but I'll just cover some highlights. First panelist is Dr. Kathie-Ann Joseph. She's a breast surgeon at NYU's Langone Medical Center, where she's also Director of Breast Services of the South Manhattan Network for NYC Health and Hospitals Corporation. She's a Harvard graduate. She received her medical degree from Columbia University, and her general surgery residency was at NYU Medical Center. She's done an oncology fellowship also at Columbia and holds a number of grants for breast cancer research. So a very prolific clinician and researcher. And join me in welcoming Dr. Joseph here today.
I'll turn on the mic so you can hear me. Thank you for having me. I think what I'll do is share a little bit about my background, and I think by sharing a little bit of my background, it'll sort of give you a little bit of an idea of how it led me to where I am today. I grew up and I still live in Brooklyn, New York, and I work in Manhattan, and I'm the daughter of immigrant parents, and so I have that that sort of gives you a little bit of how I got there. So I know all about tiger moms and tiger dads. I think that's the whole thing that's been coming up. I know all about that, but my parents were not that strict, but my parents came from Jamaica. And so it was never a question of whether or not I was going to go to college. It just was not, it was not a question for me or my siblings. I was going to go to college. Even though they did not have the means, we went to public school, my siblings and I. They were going to figure out a way for all of us to go to college. Even though, I never considered myself a leader in the sense of always being out front and for everybody, and I was never actually the outspoken one. I was actually very shy. I always knew I was different. And I don't mean that in an arrogant way, but I knew I was different in the sense that I was smart. My parents pushed me, from early on. So, I skipped several grades in school, and they pushed me. And my parents were always the ones, I always attributed to them. They figured out ways for my siblings and I to get the best education possible. When they realized, when they first got there, they trusted the school system. They thought all schools were the same. They realized quickly that was not. We grew up in Flatbush. I don't know if you know much about New York City. And when they realized that, I was the youngest. When my older sister went to junior high school and realized it was not that good, they demanded that we switch to a different district. So those are the things that they did. I went to a specialized high school called Stuyvesant High School, which is a school that you have to test into. And if you know anything about Stuyvesant, it's a science-oriented school, and there's no other criteria to get into the school other than taking a test. That's it. They don't care what you look like, who you are, you just take the test. So people like, Thelonious Mark or James Cagney, Lucy Liu, Tim Robbins, those are people, David Axelrod, Eric Holder, the Attorney General, they've all graduated from Stuyvesant. It's a school where, people will travel an hour, hour and a half to go to this school. That's how great this school is. And I really attribute this school to transforming my life, because it was finally a place where I felt comfortable being among people that were like me. And I wasn't different. And I could study the things that I was interested in. The teachers were, they motivated me. It was a fantastic experience. I always say Stuyvesant was actually more challenging than college. It was, and I think that for a school where children commuted from all 5 boroughs to go to the school, it tells a lot about the school, and it's still a wonderful school. How I got to Harvard is really, really accidental. It was never, unlike now where I think kids really think a lot about college, it's in the back of their mind almost from like the time they're born. It was not for me, because I didn't know anyone who went to Harvard. And so when it came junior year or end of junior year or early senior year to apply for colleges, there were a group of us that were thinking about applying early. And I didn't apply early because I thought I was so great that I could get in early. I wanted to apply early because I wanted to save my family money. I just didn't want to apply to a lot of schools. My mother was sick, she had cancer, and I thought, well, maybe this would be a way of, if I got into a school early, I could save my parents some money. And what happened was I thought about Cornell, actually, initially, and only because that was the only school I had ever visited. And a friend of mine said to me, well, if you apply early, this was in 1986, she said, if you apply early, they had an early decision program at that time, you have to go. You're committing yourself to that school. I mean, I was really naive about the whole process. At that time, my parents were supportive, but they weren't as involved as many families are at this time. So you have to go. And she was applying to Yale, and I said, well, if you're applying to Yale, well, I was thinking to myself, I'll go to Harvard. I'll apply to Harvard. And I had that early action program. And that's really what happened. And so that was completely the thing. That was completely the way it happened. I really just, and I was fortunate, though, to have mentors along the way that supported me. So I went through Harvard and and then went on to medical school at Columbia. And from there, applying to doing the medical school and doing the master's in public health and having that, background in public health issues. But getting to leadership, I think that doing surgery and having the surgical background continues to build your leadership skills. When you're training to be a surgeon, you're a part of a team, and everyone on that surgical team has a role. From whether you're the medical student to the intern, whether you're the 3rd year as a consult, and I'll explain what that is. Consult meaning that you're the one that when there's a new patient that needs to be seen and has to be worked up and decide whether that person needs to go to the operating room, that's your role as the 3rd year resident, or you're the chief resident. And that's your last year as a resident. Surgery is a 5-year program. That's one of the longest residencies in medicine. It's 5 years, and that's after medical school. So you're spending 5 years of training on top of your 4 years of medical school training to learn to be a surgeon. And, during those 5 years, you may be asked to do a lot of things that you really necessarily don't know why you're learning why you're doing those things. As an intern, you're really at the bottom of the totem pole. But during those 5 years, I had many chief residents, many senior residents that I learned from in terms of training to be a leader. I had some great chief residents that I thought were fantastic leaders, and I had some not so great ones. You can learn from the good ones as well as from the bad ones. And as I moved up myself in terms of being a chief resident, I learned from all of those people that came ahead of me. And I learned then to become a chief resident myself, that learned to become a leader in terms of being able to teach my junior residents, to learn how to protect my junior residents from other services that would want to, what we call scut them out to do extra work that they didn't need to be done. And also, I also wanted to prepare them for emergencies, because as a surgeon, you have to learn to make snap decisions, and you need to prepare them for emergencies that come in through the emergency room or in the operating room. I finished my residency in 2002. So I was a chief resident from 2001 to 2002. During that time, we had multiple emergencies, including September 11th. And that day started out as any ordinary day, and we had a case that I was really excited to do with my attending, which was a liver resection that I was quite excited to do, because we had never done something like that before. And a student said to me that she had seen, I was at Bellevue, which is one of the oldest hospitals in the country, and she said she had seen a plane fly into the Twin Tower, and we thought she was crazy. And the rest is history, as you all know. And we didn't leave that hospital for 3 days. So those are the things that we need to be prepared for when is part of the training. And so some of the things that that come forward, you never know what you may need to be prepared for. We had to go down to the emergency room, get everyone set up for all the patients that we thought may have to come in. Unfortunately, we didn't have a lot of patients coming in, a lot of survivors, but we did have some. I'm going to stop right here, and then I'll let my other colleagues continue, and then I'll be happy to take questions.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Joseph. I'd like to now introduce, sitting next to me, Colonel Bryan McCoy. Colonel McCoy was commanding officer of 3rd Battalion, 4th Marine Regiment from May 2002 through July 2004, and led his battalion through 2 combat tours in Operation Iraqi Freedom. His unit was the first Marine unit to enter Baghdad on April 7th of 2003, and was a unit to pull down the Saddam statue in Firdas Square. You may remember that iconic image we've seen over and over again of the statue coming down. During the second tour, 3rd Battalion Marines saw action during Operation Vigilant Resolve, the battle for Fallujah during April and May 2004. His awards include Legion of Merit with Combat V, and Gold Star in lieu of second award, the Bronze Star with Combat V, the Purple Heart, and Combat Action Ribbon with Gold Star. He is currently, or until very recently, I think a day or two ago, was the Chief of Operations, United States Central Command. So please welcome Colonel McCoy.
Sir, thank you for the introduction. First, before I get started, I'd like to thank the Naval Academy and certainly the Hart Foundation for putting this on. It gives us an opportunity to talk about our profession with other professionals. I'd also like to thank all the youngsters that are out there wearing uniform for joining up when your nation is at a time of war, even when it means 100% that you are going to go in harm's way. And then also for the Cold Warriors out there that served and frankly toiled for decades in obscurity in a time that was neither peace nor war. Thank you for your service, and I know we didn't, I had one foot in each camp. Didn't always enjoy the support we have from our countrymen that we certainly do today. So again, thank you. Origins of leadership. I'll take a stab at it. I did a Google search on it last night. When you Google leadership, you come up with about 160 million hits. Then when you Google origins of leadership, it's about 9 million hits. And then finally, whether leaders are born or bred, about 2.8 million hits. And I read every single one of them last night. But for the purpose of the discussion, are leaders born or are they made? I'll go ahead and address the question. I think we all know what the answer is. That's why we have leadership institutions. If we were all born, we were all landed gentry, and it was innate in us, and there was a divine right to lead, we probably wouldn't be having this discussion. But I'll go out on a limb here and I'll say unequivocally, yes, they're born and made. You can take a look at your personality type makeup. Everybody familiar with the Myers-Briggs type indicators? The 16 basic personality test? Fortunately, that wasn't a discriminator for me to get a commission in the Marine Corps, because my personality type tells me I should either be a florist or in the priesthood. And believe me, the Vatican doesn't return my calls. Point is that we can learn, and we can learn behaviors. Mr. Buckingham talked about you need to be born with some things, and that is true. In your personality, you have to have a high social IQ. You have to understand the human condition, and you have to continue to study that as well. I would tell you, leadership, if I were going to put it in an irreducible bottom line, leadership is about creating belief. In whatever program, philosophy, mission set that you have, it's creating belief in those people that are out there and having them sign up and follow you willingly to accomplish it. And I think Mr. Buckingham did a marvelous job of laying out the core score and some of those techniques that make you more effective down the road. As I said, it's a social endeavor, it's a human endeavor, and it's necessary that as you study, you learn to not be mechanistic, but humanistic, and be able to be empathetic to the human condition. You know, leaders come in all shapes and sizes. You know, that's why Baskin-Robbins has 31 flavors, frankly. All right, and you have to find out what works for you, and you cannot operate outside of your personality. You have to accept your personality for what it is, build on those strengths, and frankly, I use people around me to fill in my weaknesses. Right? And not that you don't study and prepare for your own weaknesses and try and fill those gaps in, but it's understanding yourself, seeking self-improvement, and acknowledging those shortcomings. Right? And it's about the unit, not you, and so that's where the little bit of humility has to come in. I would also tell you leadership is about will, and it's about character. And if you're going to develop one trait, it would have to be character first. In this war, this kind of war, the counterinsurgency we're fighting, and I've met this enemy face to face and looked him in the eye and talked to him, some of the prisoners that we've had, and they see our way of life as an abomination. And they intend to end our way of life. They mean every word they say. Your job as leaders is to take America's youth, last year's high school senior, and lead them into that cauldron, which is the most corrosive environment on the planet in terms of your morals and your scruples. And to come out of that whole physically, if possible, and spiritually. That's a tall order. You being able to develop that character is paramount. Character, reputation is what other people think of you. It's what other people believe of you. And they may be right, or they may be wrong. Character, however, is what you really are deep down inside, and only you know the difference. And it is something that you have to work every day and earn every single day. This is the moral imperative of leadership. I would also tell that you need to make sure that your aim is right. As John A. Lejeune said, the first duty of a leader is to first purge your soul of any impure motives, not for place or rank, not lured by ambition or goaded by necessity, but in simple obedience to duty. If you've got that bit right, and it's not about you, it's about those that you serve, and to put a fine point on it, you serve those that you lead, then I think you're on the right track to developing your leadership. It's not about striking a bold leadership pose or gesticulating with the knife edge of your hand. All right, those are all, they look good in the movies, but that's not what it's about. There is a time to do that. There's a time where you do say, follow me, and there's a time where you go forward and you put metal into meat. And those days are coming. But your job is to make sure that you have developed that rapport, that empathy, that human-to-human contact with those that you lead. And you've prepared yourself to be worthy of that. Walking off the block, as soon as you get your commission, you're granted that authority by your commission. You earn that moral authority by your preparation and your service. There are 5,000 years of recorded military history. All right, you need to make a dent in it. You need to have a 5,000-year-old mind and not allow mistakes of the past to be made by you again, if you can at all help it. And then finally, your role as a leader. The Greek philosopher Heracles, at 500 BC, 2,500 years ago, stated, of every 100 men in battle, 10 shouldn't even be there. 80 are nothing but targets. 9 are the real fighters, and we're lucky to have them since they make the battle. But 1 is the warrior, and he brings the rest home. I would tell you that no matter what walk of life, that ratio pretty much pans out. I've been commissioned for 27 years, and I've spent most of that time standing in front of Marines and sailors in a leadership position. And I'll tell you that ratio about holds true. Everybody in this room is somewhere in that paragraph. And this is the talk you have with yourself in the mirror. You look yourself in the mirror and you ask where you're at the top of that paragraph with the 10 or down at the bottom as a 1. And if you say you're the 1, then is there enough evidence to convict you of being accused of a leader, of being that warrior? What is your body of work? Your job at the end of the day as that 1 is to make those 80 fight like the 9. To make them believe, to create enough belief that they rise above their own perceived shortcomings and fight like the 9. And for me, that sums up about as succinctly as I can in a couple minutes leadership and the development of it. Are they born or made? Yes. You need to know what God gave you. You know what God gave everybody else. And what he didn't put in, you need to study. And work to communally raise your weaknesses while expanding on those strengths. And I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thanks, Colonel McCoy. And now to my right, I have the pleasure of introducing Mr. Ryan Setzer, who's a leadership and development specialist and the co-author of The Ultimate Medical Manager, Leadership for Results. He has conducted over 1,000 seminars in the U.S. and abroad in industries ranging from healthcare to professional athletics. His leadership philosophy has been presented to over 6,500 conference attendees. Coupled with his previous experience as a manager and trainer of pro athletes and as a professional athlete himself, his insights have transformed audience perspectives and skills around the globe. And you may be wondering, what is his professional athlete background? We got to talk a little bit as we were standing outside. I'm actually sitting next to an ex-professional kickboxer. And I just got to tell you, when I go home and tell my sons that tonight, my cool quotient's going to go way up that I have that experience. So join me in welcoming Mr. Setzer.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Brad. Following such a dynamic presentation as I just did with Colonel McCoy, this is a tough place to be right now. That was absolutely outstanding, and it hit most of the marks that I had listed on my sheet, so I can just almost defer backward and say that was great, perfect. I think it was right on track with what we're missing today. We live in a society today, and I'll touch on some athletics and some of the things that brought me to this point in life. We live in a world today where we have a lot of expectations, but it doesn't seem to have a lot of ambition. I know I'm in a different audience today. You guys have an ambition. That's why you're here. You were selected. You worked your behinds off to get here. You did things not just with expectations, but with drive and ambition. That's great. Most people sit around and expect. They are not inspired. There are people out there that have a proclivity at many things. There are athletes that have a proclivity at their athletics. That's not guaranteeing a destiny to be a champion of the world. There are academics that have a proficiency at their studies, but that's no guarantee they're going to be the world's great thinkers. There are a lot of people that have a proficiency to solve problems and communicate ideas. That does not guarantee them a destiny of fixing our world's woes or communicating an idea that the masses or even an individual will accept. That difference will make them a leader. So it's not the proficiency. It really is going to be you're creating your own destiny, and there will be training involved. I do believe, as Colonel McCoy said, you are born with certain things. It's your job then to go out and use those things. There's a lot of natural-born talents out there. I have a younger son that is a natural-born athlete. He will move to his own level of comfort, and his level of comfort starts out higher than many others. But until he became more of a student at what he was doing, he didn't become as good as he could be. That's the same thing in leading other people. There are many managers. To me, managers tell and arrange. Most of the managers in our country seem to get promoted in their ranks by being, number one, being a superstar doer. Number two, being there longer than everybody else. You've been there for a long time. You take charge for a while. Somehow being related to the boss, that comes into play often. In all honesty, those are all qualities, and I can't say they're wrong, but they do not guarantee that you will be able to lead and influence the efforts of others. That's leadership. Leadership is about inspiration. Leadership is about influence. Leadership is about gaining the acceptance of others. And you've already hit a lot of the good stuff today that I think you're going to have to separate yourself with. Leaders do have vision. They have a vision of an exciting tomorrow. But more importantly, they also have people skills. Keep people skills to inspire others to make it come true. Because as John Maxwell said, and there's a couple of things that I would quote him in saying, John Maxwell is one of the country's leading management specialists, wrote a book called Developing the Leader Within, as well as a number of other books that I recommend. He said that are leaders born? Absolutely. How else did they get on the planet? So we're all born, but are we born to lead? Not necessarily. That does take training. That takes effort. That takes energy. That takes focus. And most importantly, you can write this one down, that takes understanding. It takes understanding about others. It takes subordinating yourself and sometimes your desires, your likes, self-sacrifice, and putting forth the effort to show others how they can succeed and where we're going. You have to have that vision, and you have to have those people skills. For the initiative that I'm working with in D.C. right now, I'm working with an organization that does about $100 million in sales. We have about 55 locations, and we have about 500 or so employees at any given time. With that, about 20% of those are managers who are put in a position where, in all honesty, they were great doers, they were great technically minded, they understood the process, they understood the procedure. Then suddenly they're in charge of getting that same kind of work or better work out of others, and that's been their chore. My job is to go around and help turn people into the leaders, and I start that with changing their mindset, because I believe leadership is a mindset before it becomes a skill set. I believe you have to think like a leader before you act and perform like a leader. I think there's certainly things that we can do technically, and you will gain the admiration and you'll have a respect for being able to accomplish things yourself. But in the end, that's not leadership. Leadership is accomplishing those efforts, those great results through the efforts of others. And if you're not leading, as John Maxwell says, you're just out taking a walk. If you look around and nobody's there, you're just out taking a walk. And unfortunately, a lot of people will find themselves in that position when it becomes more of a me, my, gimme. Oh, look at me, I'm achieving. Oh, look at me, I'm in charge. Oh, look at me, what kind of plaques and awards and all that have I had? And if you don't stand before the group when you accept them and say, it's not for me, it's for all those who serve with me, you would probably be losing the following of the crowd. So it's really a mindset before it's a skill set. There are a lot of strategies and techniques out there, but for me, the most important thing is getting the right mental focus, and then that will turn into the correct technical focus down the road. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Mr. Setzer. And our final panelist is Brigadier General Howard Prince. He is the director for the Center of Ethical Leadership in the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas. He wanted to clarify, in the program it says he is the director of the Lyndon B. School, and he says that's not true, so be aware. He is a 1962 honor graduate of West Point. He earned his PhD in psychology from the University of Texas at Austin. Before joining the University of Texas, he was a founding dean of the Jepson School of Leadership Studies at University of Richmond. He also served a number of years as professor and head of the Department of Behavioral Sciences and Leadership at West Point. He, on active duty, served in the 82nd Airborne and 1st Cavalry Divisions. His military awards and decorations include 2 awards for the Purple Heart in combat, 2 Bronze Stars for Valor, the Bronze Star for Service, the Distinguished Flying Cross for Valor, and the Silver Star for Valor. Please welcome Brigadier General Prince.
Thanks very much, Dr. Johnson. Let me also say how much I consider this opportunity to be with you today a high honor and indeed a privilege. Anytime someone has a chance to participate in an activity like this at one of our great military academies, which are national treasures, that's something that you should never pass up. I also want to thank the donors and the sponsors who make this possible, and the tribal elders who are here to oversee your investment and make sure it's well spent. The question where leaders are born is an old question, and while I was on active duty, I had a chance to attend the leadership conference here at this great academy probably 20 years ago, and it wasn't for students, it was for faculty and staff. And many of the people who were there were on active duty, and we were all asked to wear civilian clothes. So everybody in the audience was in civilian clothes. You couldn't see people's rank, like Colonel McCoy, he stands out. And one young person stood up in a nice conservative business suit, young-looking member of the conference, who stood very tall and straight. He had great bearing, and he began his presentation by saying he was at the conference to answer the question whether leaders are born or made. And after he said that, he said, "My name is Captain Charles Leader, United States Marine Corps." Well, he's the only born leader I've ever met. We all come in this world with different talents and strengths. We know that. We differ on things like intelligence, stamina, extroversion, introversion, other things that are relevant. And for 2,000 years, people believed there was a set of qualities that would make you a leader. And if you didn't have those qualities, you should just be a follower, just fall in line. And people tried seriously for over 2,000 years to figure out how to identify people. Because if you believe leaders are born, then the challenge is to select them. Use the Myers-Briggs. And as you heard earlier, that's really an adequate tool for teasing out who has the right stuff and who doesn't. So there are really 2 reasons why we can't rely on selection. Because we don't know what the right combination is. I use Marcus Buckingham's strength finder instrument. There's 35 strengths, but we don't know which 5 are the best. All that instrument tells you is, here are your 5, and if you use these, you're likely to be more effective, but other people have 5 different ones, so there's no such thing as a universal set. The other reason, which is, I think, really relevant to you in the audience, is that human development is so complicated, so unpredictable, and your potentials are unknown at the stage of life you're in. No one knows who in this room among the Naval Academy midshipmen is going to be a future Chief of Naval Operations. Potentially any of you could be, given the right circumstances. And I once worked for a superintendent at West Point who told cadets that whether you become a general or not depends on whether there's a war during your career. So there are things that may be beyond your control no matter how great a leader you are. Research using twins shows that most of what we think of as leadership is complex learned behavior. And that's good news and it's bad news. It's bad news because we can't develop a test that just picks the leaders. It's good news because every one of you sitting in the audience can become a better leader than you already are. And so if you accept the argument that leaders are more developed than a natural phenomenon, then that raises at least 2 questions in my mind. One question is, what should you try to develop? And what should people who are involved with you and trying to create opportunities for you be trying to develop? And so that what gets developed is one question, and the other question is, how do you produce development? How do you cause human change? So let me give you some answers that I've tried to frame in ways that they're relevant to undergraduate college students. I know there are other people in the room, but this is a really important question. For those of you that attend federal service academies, you are immersed in very complicated, sophisticated, intentional leadership development systems that you take for granted. You are at your academy for 4 years and you go through the program and you come out a different person by design, by plan. The take is different for each one of you, but on average, all of you develop certain things to a higher degree than you had when you entered. That's not true for civilian higher education. Civilian higher education doesn't have that kind of an emphasis in any place that I know of except the University of Richmond with the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, which I was privileged to be a part of. So for those of you that are at the academies, listen up because this might help you make sense out of what you're going through. For those of you not at an academy, this may be helpful to you in figuring out what should I be trying to do in the time I have left to make myself a better leader. The first thing that gets developed, and this usually should come later, is what I'll call technical or professional expertise. Leadership's not the end. Leadership is a means toward achieving valued outcomes. And it always takes place in a setting like government, business, the military, education, you name it. Don't spend your undergraduate years developing that kind of expertise. I'm amazed at college students who have double, triple majors, who confuse why they're in college with getting a job. You can learn that kind of expertise when you go to graduate school, or you learn it from the organization where you go to work. Instead, as an undergraduate, spend your time acquiring knowledge about the most complicated thing in the world. It's called the human being. That's what makes leadership so challenging, so difficult, because leadership is about human beings interacting together toward common purpose. So learn everything you can about people. That means taking courses in psychology, philosophy, history, theology, anthropology, wherever you can learn about people, literature, learn about other cultures, learn about how we're different, how we're similar around the world. Leadership's hard work. It takes a lot of stamina if you choose to offer yourself for leadership or it's thrust upon you. Leaders have to work longer and harder than anybody else who take it seriously. They have to deal with lots of conflict and unprecedented challenges. Marcus Buckingham suggested that to be a leader, you have to get others to be willing to go into the unknown. Well, who helps the leader go into the unknown? The leader walks first into the valley of the shadow of death, perhaps. So work hard on developing yourself physically and emotionally. Work out. Develop an exercise routine that will be part of your lifestyle for the rest of your life. It's important to develop yourself spiritually. And by that I mean figuring out what gives you meaning and purpose about your life. Don't become an egotist wrapped up in your own self. You won't attract anybody as a follower if that's where you get stuck. And some people find spirituality and religion. I think we can find it in many, many other ways, wherever you find purpose and meaning. I was fortunate enough to be allowed to serve in the United States Army for 28 years. And that gave me a great sense of purpose. I found purpose and meaning in the ideal of service and the ideal of sacrifice. So find something that you can attach yourself to that gives you a sense of why you're here, what difference your life makes. We need to develop ourselves socially. That means figuring out how to get along with other people. You've got to be able to attract people to your vision. It also means becoming involved in your community, becoming somebody who's not a complainer, but somebody who's a doer. You need to develop yourself ethically. This may be more important than getting a degree. You need to figure out what you stand for, what you believe is right and wrong, and what you will not stand for. Where will you draw the line? Will it be when a boss asks you to falsify an official document? Will it be when your boss asks you to falsify your boss's performance on a physical fitness test? Where's that line? And ethics is hard because, by definition, they're subjective. And yet, globally, there's evidence that people agree more than they disagree on basics like truth-telling, promise-keeping, responsibility, respect for human life. Today, you're growing up in an age of moral relativism. You may even have been taught by people who argue that cultures have different ethics and values, and one culture shouldn't question the values of another. I disagree with that as strongly as anything I can think of, because I think humanity trumps culture. If another culture does harm to its own people, that is wrong, and I'm not prepared to. I may not be able to go to war with them. I probably wouldn't go to war with them, but I'd certainly stand up and try to be counted. So those are the things to be developed. Knowledge of people, physical strength and stamina, find a sense of meaning and purpose, learn how to connect with other people, and figure out what you stand for ethically. How do you do this? Well, first of all, you're in the ideal place. By definition, you're in a learning environment. So study widely. I'll say it again, one major is enough, and it doesn't matter which one it is. Instead, use all the extra classes you have to dabble, to study widely. It's the last time in your life you'll be able to do that. Find out what else you're interested in that you don't even know that you're interested in right now. Take classes that turn you off, because that tells you this is not me. Leaders need the widest range of interests. Engage in new experiences. Novelty is a driver of development, something you've never done before. It's risky, it's challenging, it may scare you, but that's how we develop. Don't avoid situations that involve conflict. I chuckle when I hear students at the University of Texas, where I work now, talk about leading in fraternities and sororities. That's the easiest place in the world, I can imagine, because everybody loves each other, and that's the most important thing, to be accepted, and they never have any conflict. Well, the things that matter in life involve clashes of values and strong differences. So don't avoid those. This is not to be sought out, but should it happen to you, it's an opportunity to learn. Loss and failure can be great teachers. When I began my Army career, my goal was to be the Chief of Staff of the Army. I was an infantry officer. I thought the Army was about infantry and armor, and I didn't know how to change the oil in my car, so I decided I better go with the infantry instead of those tanks. I was badly wounded, leading soldiers in combat in Vietnam, and my dream was taken away from me. And I struggled for 2 years to find new purpose, new direction. I almost left the Army, but the Army gave me a new path that led me to doing what I'm doing today, and I never could have imagined it when I first began my career. Try to learn from experience. Most people have experience, and they go from experience to experience to experience, and nothing accumulates because they don't know how to learn from experience. So how do you learn from experience? Well, the first thing you do is you step back and reflect. You ask yourself, what was I trying to do? How well did it go? What worked? Why? What didn't work? Why? What could I do better the next time? Another way you can learn from experience is to ask for feedback. I believe feedback's the breakfast of champions. Sometimes it tastes like Kellogg's All Bran. Not too good. It's not shredded wheat or Frosted Flakes. But you need to know what other people saw happening, and if you're a leader, the only way you can find out if you're followers is to ask the followers. And that's scary. Mark has talked about anxiety. Much about leadership is scary. Therefore, we need support. If you haven't figured this out, find a way to attach yourself to a mentor. I love it when a new student comes, knocks on my door, and asks if he can just talk for a minute to find out what I'm interested in. What that student is doing is seeing if there's a potential relationship there, and they're miles ahead of their peers, because that person's going to come back in a year and a half and ask me for a letter of recommendation, and they're going to come in and ask me what courses should I take. That's what mentoring means when you're a college student. You have to be ready to develop. And by that I mean you have to be willing to open yourself up to admitting I don't know this. That's the way you are on the first day of any new class. You have to be willing to risk joining a group of people that you don't know. You have to have some humility to be willing to admit you don't know how to do something. And you have to be willing to do the hard work of reflection and soliciting feedback. And finally, leadership development takes time, a lifetime. I mean that seriously. None of us is done, ever. It's a lifelong process if you take it seriously and if you're truly a humble person. When Colin Powell was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest ranking military position under our Constitution, he created a school for 2-star generals and admirals. They thought they were done. And he said, not so fast. You guys need to learn some more things. before you're done, and in order to become 3- and 4-star generals and admirals. I guess I could sum up what I'm saying, if it's a lifelong process. Make seeking challenges and new opportunities and new knowledge a habit by doing it every day. And the last thing I'd leave you with is, a lot of people are going to invest in you. They already have. You're here at this conference because somebody invested in you. There's no way you can pay those people back. My students can't write a letter of recommendation for me, but you can write one for the next generation. And I believe that's an important part of leadership too, to leave a legacy, to improve the organization, the teams you're part of, and to invest in the development of those who come along after you. Give them broad shoulders, yours, to stand on, so they can see further and do more than you ever imagined you could do. Thank you all very much for listening.
All right, thank you, General Prince. And now it is the fun part. You know, if you've been thinking about this and processing a bit, I can't believe that this panel has answered the question, born versus made, that easily. So I'm hoping you've got some questions and thoughts and you know, ways to get this panel interacting a bit. So as that happens, make your way to the microphones on both sides and speak into the microphone, and we'll take it from there. So we've got one to start off. Thank you. I think we may need to have the mics turned on. I'm not sure the mic was turned on, if we can get help.
I think if, let me see if I've got the question
Testing
right.
1, 2.
Sure. So I could do a short summary too, if you
And
like.
I think we nailed the question on born or made.
Yeah.
Next. No, I'm teasing.
So,
So, to your question, did we ever try and use the technique of creating belief in the enemy that was trying so hard to kill us? The answer is yes. In a counterinsurgency, it truly is a fight for the hearts and minds. It's also a fight for the hearts and minds of your own people every single day, those that you lead. We did that through just really everyday interaction with the local populace, because the enemy is amongst the people and comes from the people. And every time you commit a transgression against an Iraqi civilian or an Afghan civilian, you have just created another 10 insurgents. And so that was always heavily in our minds to not make more enemies than we needed to. That said, there are some that what we call the irreconcilables, that you were not going to change their minds no matter what. And you know, we spoke about recidivism, and we see that today with those that were released from Gitmo are now showing back up on the network, except now with 10 times the street cred they had before with their fellow insurgents. So there are some that, frankly, you are not going to change their minds. But by and large, people are people, and this understanding this human condition. And the average Iraqi wants to raise his family in peace, have a job, and have his kids educated, and be assured at night that neither the insurgents nor us are going to bust into his home and violate that sanctity. So yes, and that's what makes it such a caustic environment while your emotions are so pulled, because you are putting yourself out there every single day, and as a uniformed, wearing a uniform of your country in a war, you are a legitimate target. The Iraqi civilians are not. We had a saying of be polite, be professional, be prepared to kill everyone you meet. And the Iraqis, you need to look at every Iraqi as though he is out to kill you. But you cannot treat them that way. So it sounds as though it's a paradox, or I'm contradicting myself, and it is. But that's the environment that you have to operate in. And we found ourselves trying to win friends and win the hearts and minds of the average Iraqi every single day through good works and being respectful of their culture. But for the recidivists, the hardcores, there's no dealing with that. There's one way to deal with it. Does that answer your question?
It does. Quick follow-up, though. Do you have any examples of specific situations where that has worked? Where you have created a sense of belief in the American dream and,
Yeah, we saw it, frankly, every day. You saw it as what we called it our wave campaign, just riding through the cities to get out of your vehicle, to get out of that armored vehicle. Because when the Iraqis look at you, initially they're going to see a 200-pound Marine that's all kitted up with body armor and glasses and a helmet and gloves and a weapon hanging off of them. Not a really cuddly impression. And we want that too, because we want, as we say, no better friend, no worse enemy. And that's what we try to communicate. But when I met with an Iraqi, you would take the glasses off, you would take the helmet off, you'd shoulder side the weapon, and take your glove off and greet them in the Bedo fashion, and sit down and have your 3 cups of tea with them, and make that very first modest step in crossing that cultural divide. And then you saw that trust start to come back, and you started to know their families and get to introduce to them and know their kids, and they had the feeling that we were in this together.
well, thank you for your response and for your service.
Thank you.
Excellent. Let's try the other side here.
This is a question for Dr. Katie, and I was curious not even as much about the way you lead in the profession, because that's very similar in many ways to the way military leads and how that, but I was more interested in how you observe leadership within your patients, because as one of those really interesting things, illness sometimes, as something that is out of our control, results in people having to make choices and drastic changes that really shock or really cause a lot of difference in the way they live. So either if you have examples or just a general overview of how that leadership quality is portrayed differently, one because of the urgency and possibly with the cancer patients that you see, or with the ways that they interact with you or other people, and how does that change with their leadership qualities?
That's an interesting question. Well, there are different ways in which we handle that. So obviously when you're dealing with a patient and you have to tell them that they have breast cancer, people deal with that in different ways, okay? Some people will take that on as a challenge and can handle it quite well and move forward with it, and they're fine. A lot of times it really depends on how much support they have. And some people really need a lot more support. And the way, in terms of leadership, I guess what I'm trying to understand from your question is how the patient handles it from their leadership standpoint or from my standpoint. What happens generally is that the way I help that patient handle that diagnosis is by giving them a lot of support. And that way that patient can take ownership of their cancer. And by doing that, what we do is we put them in contact with other patients that have had cancer, support groups. So we have patient navigators. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but what patient navigators are, sometimes they're women or men, but they usually are women who actually are survivors themselves, that have been through it, so they may be breast cancer survivors themselves, and they actually literally navigate that patient through the hospital. So they will get that patient from one appointment to the next. They will get that patient, they will literally walk that patient to the operating room. oftentimes these patients have to go for other tests prior to surgery. So they will literally get that patient through. Chemotherapy is something else that these patients have to go through. They'll go with them through that. So if that patient needs hand holding, they'll get it. Until that patient actually gets through their treatment and they realize that, you know what, I may have had my ups and downs, but I made it through and I'm going to be okay. Okay, and through their radiation treatment. And the support groups are also helpful because they get a chance to vent their feelings, hear from other women who have been through it, and that also helps to empower these women. So,
Thank you, ma'am.
All right, go ahead.
Good morning, First Class Jennifer Tamanen from the Coast Guard Academy. This question is for all the panelists, and it's kind of fun, but at the same time, kind of important, I believe. But who has been a leader that you have admired throughout your life?
interesting.
So whoever would like to begin, go ahead.
Let me tell you, the most important leader in all of our lives is your mother. I mean that sincerely. My mother was a poor woman who only had 4 years of education, but she taught me so many things, set such high expectations for me that I miss her dearly and I'm forever in her debt. And we forget those people because they're close to us and we take them for granted. Most people, when you ask that question, will come up with a hero, somebody who's famous. But I think it's important not to lose sight of those people in our immediate environment who touched us in the deepest ways. I could give you examples from my military experience. A battalion commander in Vietnam who took over after the previous battalion commander had been killed. You want to know what being demoralized is like? Lose your CO in combat, especially somebody who knew what he was doing, and then now you've got to get used to a new person. And the way that new CO took over was inspiring, and then more importantly, what he did afterwards was inspiring because he walked with us and shared the dangers and dug his own foxhole, heated his own rations, carried a rucksack that weighed just as much as ours did.
I'll just give mine also. Certainly your parents and those people around you are obviously very influential in your life. Outside of that realm, I had several people that have made incredible impact on me. One was a guy named Charlie Wood. Charlie Wood ran a business in South Florida. He was kind of my first boss. After I segued out of my illustrious sports career that gave me enough money to blow off in about a week and a half in Miami, but boy, was it a great week and a half. I enjoyed it. Charlie actually helped me in many ways to understand the humanity or the human side. I was involved in the sales. I was selling photocopiers when nobody even knew what they were. They had just come out. I'm actually kind of old at this point, right? But people now would go, oh my God, that's not a big deal. That's brand new. Everybody wants them. Charlie helped us understand customers' needs, helped us put ourselves and what we were doing beyond just ourselves and put it on the focus of their needs, because he knew once you focused on what they needed and what would help them accomplish their goals, you'd be able to accomplish all your goals. And that's something I've taken with me in leadership for a long time. It's figuring out, where do your people want to be? Now, not as Marcus Buckingham said, not everybody's going to get an assignment they want, and not everybody's going to get to do what they want. But you have to balance it out. It's helping them understand the bigger picture, the broader picture, the bigger end result. And that goes back to vision. And if you don't believe in your own vision, you'll never get anybody else to believe in it. So Charlie was instrumental in that. He said you have to be twice as much as you'd ever expect anybody around you to ever be, because human nature will make them about half as much as you are anyway. So it was always lead by example and just be the message, be what you are. There are no exceptions, there are no excuses. You can't rely on, well, I'm in charge so I can cut corners. It's never cut to corners. It's stay intact to the mission, the purpose, and I think it's an integrity issue. When people see you doing what you're leading and believing in what you lead, they tend to follow you much easier and be more committed to your message and your outcome.
I'd have to, I've never worked for a bad leader. And in fact, I was probably raised by wolves as a young officer. I was a platoon commander for a guy named General Zinni. I was a company commander for a guy named Pete Pace, General Pete Pace, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and a battalion regimental commander for General Mattis, who's my boss now, again, for the 5th time. And I've got the scars to prove it. All great leaders, but I would say the one that had that early impact on me was my high school football coach, Bob Hartage, down here in Annandale, Virginia. When he taught us what it was to believe. He was the first to show me about creating belief. None of us were great athletes. None of us went on to Division I ball, but we had an undefeated season, and we're state champs. And that was the idea of what leadership can do to folks, and about creating belief and finding out what it is you're good at, and then piling on.
There's several, but the person I think that really had such a major impact for me was someone named Dr. Kenneth Ford. He's still alive, but he's retired. He's a colorectal surgeon. He worked at Columbia for over 50 years, and was he was the first African American to join the faculty at Columbia, and was one of the reasons why I went into surgery. The reason why is not only was a tremendous leader, he was a great teacher. He mentored dozens of people to go into surgery, and was not only just a fantastic surgeon, but also was just taught me how to just a very compassionate surgeon, how to talk to patients. He was really a surgeon.
Thank you very much.
All right, go ahead. Yeah. Whoops.
It's not a good way.
Got it.
My name is Sarah, and I'm representing University of Pacific. I am a former Marine, and my question is, the biggest thing when I got out of the Marine Corps was a transition, and now that I'm going to school, getting my education, I'm working for the VA. And I work hand in hand with disabled veterans. And we talk about leadership, we talk about opportunity, but what about the ones that have already developed that? What do we tell them? You know, I mean, I'm trying to find a better system to give them some dignity. I mean, I've gone to homeless shelters where the homeless veterans are, and it's like, you know, they fought for our country. Then what do we tell them? What type of dignity can we give them?
All
And
right.
that's where I'm lost.
Good question. So anyone want to tackle that right off? Or?
I'll try that because I consider myself to be part of a generation of veterans, a group that the nation turned its back on, the Vietnam veterans. And we have far more homeless veterans in that generation than I believe we have today, even though one is too many. When someone interrupts their life when they're young, or at any age, but especially when they're young, to serve at the risk of life, they deserve much better. Our current head of the VA, retired General Shinseki, is committed to reducing the number of homeless. He leads a huge bureaucracy that's hard to turn. One of the things I find hope in is that there are countless nonprofit organizations that have sprung up like mushrooms to provide help to veterans and to their families. That didn't exist during the post-Vietnam era, the immediate post-Vietnam era. We may not have enough organizations, but you put your finger on something that at the individual level can be a human tragedy, and if it exists on any scale is a national tragedy, because this country, any country, owes a tremendous debt of gratitude to anyone who has done what you and others that you see suffering have done. We owe them the best medical care, we owe them social services, we owe them support, we owe them recognition, we owe them esteem and gratitude. And I think it's a citizen's duty to recognize that. It's better. It's not obviously from your experience there are still problems, but it's better than it has been in the past.
I will turn on my microphone and try to, I'll chime in. I don't have the kind of background that these gentlemen have and the exposure to those type of things that you've had either. I did, and I've had a lot of jobs. That's probably why you don't see a resume there. There's not enough pages in the book. I've lived the life. One of the things that I did have an opportunity to do in South Florida for a period of time was work with people that were injured on the job, workers' compensation. I'm not a technician. I'm not a doctor. I don't have those skills. My job was to help them segue from making, and this was more construction workers and people with blue collar, but they were making a decent living, making a good living. They had no education background to really speak of. They really had no future skills possibly that they could think of. And my job was to help them segue into the next part of their life. There was very little support for the person that was injured. There was a few dollars that would be given to them to compensate for something, and medical bills were paid up to a point, and that was it. My job was to help them to see the future. My job, which I think is part of the leader's job, my job was to help them look back and go, let's not dwell on what we've lost. Let's not dwell on what we sacrificed. Let's take a look at what you've got. Let's take a look at your strengths. Let's take a look at your skills. Let's take a look at your interests. Let's narrow that down first and move forward from there, because we can't fix the past, so we shouldn't dwell in it. We can learn from it. We shouldn't fear the future. We got to prepare for it and go forward, but we got to seize the moment we have right now. And that really helped a lot of my people move forward and gave them, I think, the dignity that you're trying to mention. Yeah, they feel cheated. They feel ripped off in many ways, but they have to look at what they did and why they did it. They didn't do it for pats on the back. They didn't do it for glory, in all honesty. If they did, it was probably the wrong decision.
And he was standing there talking to a man who had a huge upper body, but he was sitting in a wheelchair. And when I walked over, I realized that he was wearing shorts, and he's a double amputee above the knee. And General Brooks introduced me to this man who was a medically retired lieutenant colonel. He said, "This is one of my battalion commanders in Iraq." And this guy was so upbeat. His daughter was there with him, providing assistance to him. And when it came time to board, he was the first person allowed to board the aircraft. And he looked up and smiled and he said, "See, if you lose your legs, they put you on first." So, I mean, here's a guy who's accepted and moving on, and he's had tremendous medical care, and he walked into the airplane. He was sitting in a wheelchair, but he had 2 canes, and he walked into the airplane. And there wasn't a person on that flight who wasn't inspired by the sheer act of bravery that represented. And so there's the dark side and the bright side of making something out of a terrible tragedy.
Great. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Trig Murphy, Business Management Major, Leadership Studies minor at Morehouse College. I'd like to say first thank you for the panel for their insight. My question is for Dr. Joseph, fellow New York native as myself from Brooklyn, New York. You said that leaders are both made and born, but also leaders emerge. During September 11th, how did you emerge as a leader in a time of crisis? And also, given your past life lessons, what qualities and characteristics did you use and utilize to do so? Thank you.
Well, I think that all of our training, all of the training that I had during my residency prepared us, all of us, not me and all of us, for September 11th and any emergency that came up. You know, we worked as a team. We all came together to work as a team that day, but I mean, clearly, we had never had a day like that day. You know, there was a lot of uncertainty initially because we didn't know initially what was going on. We didn't know if there were going to be more attacks initially. We didn't know what was going on. But what we did was we all worked together, surgery, the emergency room staff. We came together and just sort of everything stopped. We stopped all our elective surgeries that day. And the whole staff basically went down to the emergency bay, our trauma center. Bellevue is a level 1 trauma center, by the way, and just said, look, we're just going to focus on getting prepared for whatever trauma comes in. Because when it became clear to us that this was really a disaster of enormous proportions, we just said, well, we became prepared for, we thought there were going to be more casualties coming in. So what we did was all the chief residents and our chairman and other attendings came over from NYU, which is just a few blocks up the street, and we just basically formed teams at each stretcher. And we basically stayed there all day and into the night, prepared for patients. Unfortunately, not that many came in. But I learned a lot from that experience. We had a few come in and a few firefighters, actually, that we took care of. And they made it through. So we were very proud to take care of those firefighters. And then several of my colleagues, I was pregnant at that time too, there were some of my colleagues went down to the site, which is not far. Bellevue's on the lower east side. So some of my colleagues actually went down to the site. I was pregnant at the time, but my colleagues didn't know that, so I decided to stay on the site. And I just took care of the patients at Bellevue with my team. But it was really it's an experience that I won't ever forget. It was extremely sad to see a lot of people. At that time, Bellevue was plastered with pictures, missing people coming up to you if they saw you in a white coat, asking if their relative was in the hospital. I think it's, hopefully we'll never have an experience like that again.
Thank you for your courage.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
All of us here understand that being a leader is primarily being a servant to others, but we also have our own dreams and our desires of what we want to be when we grow up. But how do you coordinate being a servant in your leadership position and what you want to do, your own personal ambitions?
Okay.
That's all.
Good. So balancing personal drive and motivation with service. Anyone want to tackle that?
One way you might consider doing that is to see if anybody else wants to come along for the ride. Marcus Buckingham talked about the importance of the leader being somebody who's an optimist, who shows the way, and you may have found something that drives you that's about something bigger than your own self, your own selfish goals, your own career. It could be something that benefits others. The challenge, and it's a lifelong one in my view, that never goes away. None of us is totally selfless. The military asks you to be selfless. Nobody's totally selfless. But to try to minimize your own egoistic drives and attach them to things that other people see as important too. I always tell students, Richard Nixon may epitomize the person who was in it for himself. I mean, he was so power hungry that he was willing to have his subordinates commit crimes so he could stay in power. And put Mother Teresa over here on the other side, a woman who gave up her life to help the dying. Find a place somewhere between Mother Teresa and Richard Nixon, and the closer you are to Mother Teresa, the happier you'll be.
I would start by saying every leadership manual, every leadership presentation, anything on leadership you ever touch, there ought to be a big warning label on it that says, caution, without genuine concern, this is all worthless. And if you can't answer that question going into it, that you're doing this out of genuine concern and genuine service, and that you know the difference between appointed and anointed, if you can't keep that straight, then you're probably going down the wrong path. And that's where your leadership, that job has become a means to an end instead of something righteous and good. Does that make sense? Does that answer?
Yes. Thank you, sir.
If you're in the military, forget about trying to get yourself promoted. Just do your job, and the promotions will come.
All right, we have about, maybe about 5 minutes or so before we need to start wrapping up, and I'm sure people are starting to think about lunch, and it's close by, so we have a little more time here. Go ahead.
I'll make this fast. Hi, my name is Laura. I am a delegate from the University of Pennsylvania's Fox Leadership Program, and I guess my question more specifically pertains to Mr. Setzer's expertise. but I'm a member of the track and field team at Penn, and my cross country team in particular. And my coach this year, for whatever reason she had, decided not to name a team captain. And people came to her on their own and requested to be named, even after she specifically said she wasn't going to. And I do believe in a way it held us back not having anyone in a leadership position, but she became so defensive that she was set on not naming anyone. And I just wondered, is there a way to ask for a leadership position? And if so, what's the best way to go about it?
Well, it's interesting. Did anybody ask her why she chose not to assign a captain? That'd be the first thing I would probably ask, is just to get an understanding of her thought behind it.
I believe we had one senior, and the senior probably wouldn't have made the best leader. And I think in her head she just couldn't think of anyone, and so said, "We're just not going to do it this year."
Okay. I probably wouldn't think that was, obviously the results were not as positive as you guys wanted, because you wanted somebody. In your case, a captain of a team is setting a pace for the team. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that's probably another point where I think the doctor was mentioning, sometimes a leader will emerge if they're allowed to emerge. It sounds like your coach kind of pushed it back and repressed it, as opposed to letting that one person or two people that may have come out and said, "Hey, okay, we don't have any true captain, but we'll just, let's band together, let's make it happen, let's let it run." It probably should have been allowed to let emerge itself and not hold it back. Again, I don't know what the motivations were for your coach. I think it's always good to have a leader. You either assign a leader or you let the leader evolve from the group. In athletics, obviously there's many different ways of doing that. I was in quote an individual sport in most people's mind, but we had a hell of a team around us, in all honesty, to prepare us to do our job on that night. And if you ever watch a boxing match, the guy doesn't come back or the female doesn't come back to the corner all by themselves and give themselves water and work on their cuts. And I had 142 stitches. I didn't say I was good at this, but I did have a very good cut man, and his name was Rocky Golio, and he did an excellent job. So you have a team there, and I think that's what probably your team should have banded together and locked together with each other and said, okay, we'll kind of have our own unstated, unsaid, but we're going to band together, and somebody should have maybe taken that lead at that point. It seems like you had, and the best way to ask is go back and say, I appreciate we don't have anybody that clearly stands out. I would like to take that role, or I would like for us to nominate. You certainly could nominate in that case, or you could band together and say, okay, we'll all band together and we'll work together to make this happen. But I think in most cases, if it's allowed to happen, somebody will step out, especially athletes. The greatest talent in the world, you can put the greatest basketball team with the greatest talent in the world without a coach. They will self-destruct. They will not self-direct, because egos, which Marcus McGann was talking about, will start conflicting and competing for that lead role. When they lose focus on where we go, it's always step back and why are we here? What are we trying to do? And rise out, even if it's not formalized, we should allow it to rise out kind of in an informal manner, I guess, at that point. So, the best way to say it is you got to be a salesperson once in a while. And if you went up to your coach and said, I appreciate your situation that we're in. We feel we'd like to have somebody kind of representing and pushing us. We have this person. We feel they'd be good. Is it okay if we allow them to be the captain of the team? And generally speaking, when you got to sell them on the fact. What is it's going to hurt more by not having one than help by not having one. Let us help you see this. And generally, people in leadership role will listen. They will come to your aid at that point and say, okay, if you guys want it, let's make it happen, because you are the team, and the ultimate result is the team working together. Hope that answers the question.
No, I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Go ahead.
Hi, this is for anyone on the panel, but it seems that farther we go up in business or politics that people are willing to make allowances for differences, maybe perhaps ethically, between their professional life and their personal life. And society seems to make account for that as well. I'm wondering what the panel's thoughts on that are, between if you're a true leader, if there really is a distinction between what you do personally and what you do professionally. Thank you.
So can a really effective leader do one thing in public or on the job and something very different in his personal life?
I'll take a crack at it. I think it probably depends on what business you're in. In our business, and I don't think you can. I think the stakes are too great. Again, I talked about leading last year's high school senior into that cauldron that is the most corrosive environment on earth. You don't do that part-time, right? You don't have the character you put on to go to work and then the character you have at home. It needs to be part of your DNA. It needs to course through your veins 24/7, 365. You know, I know I'm a Marine, and I know we put cult in culture as people talk, but it is what you are, not what you do. There was the saying, your actions speak so loudly, I can't hear what you say. And those actions need to be spot on 24/7, because there is no going home and taking it off. You live in a goldfish bowl as a leader, and the things that you do, especially when nobody's watching, defines you.
I agree with the importance of this for the military profession. You also know the American people at the ballot box made it clear that it didn't matter to them. I'd like to address the question at the level of the individual. Some people can compartmentalize who they are. They can be one person in another situation, another person in another situation, maybe be ethical in one situation and unethical in another, and suffer no adverse emotional consequences from that. I don't know how many people can do that very well, but I bet it's not many. And one of the things that helps keep us on the path of striving to live a life of integrity is the experience of shame and guilt and anxiety, even in anticipation of doing something wrong. So it may or may not affect your leadership. In the military, it will affect your leadership. In other places, it will not. For most of us, it can have a very detrimental effect on our lives as individual human beings if we aren't consistent. To me, that's the real meaning of integrity. Many people think integrity means honesty. Integrity means wholeness and consistency and living out what you say you believe all the time. And I suggest that to you as a personal ideal, because it can lead to a life of fulfillment, a life of satisfaction. And when you have as much gray hair as I have, that's something I spend a lot of time thinking about. I'm at a stage in life called generativity versus despair by developmental psychologists. And what that means is you're looking back on your life and asking, was it worthwhile? Did I do any good? And if you can't answer that in the affirmative, was I two-faced? If you can't answer those questions in a positive way, then you're stuck near the end of life. And earlier in life, it can produce negative psychological, perhaps behavioral consequences that you don't want to have as part of your life. So I encourage you to try to live lives of integrity, lives of consistency, lives of wholeness, lives that where you are what you say you believe in. And you can live a relatively guilt-free life, not experience shame, and end up proud of what you've done.
We are right about at the end. I see we have just one more on each side. So I wonder if we can do these fairly quickly, and maybe if you could each direct your question to one of the panelists, we'll do that. So do you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. My name's Catherine. I'm from American University. And Dr. Prince mentioned somewhat offhandedly this idea that sometimes becoming a general isn't simply an issue of whether there's a war on. And I was wondering if you could speak to this issue of this broader issue of timing and leadership outside the context of war.
Well, maybe I'm on. Am I on? Yeah. Okay, I'm on. Timing can be important. What my boss was saying is that in wartime we expand. There are casualties, and there are more opportunities to rise to the highest levels. Dr. King said the same thing. Dr. King advised young people to prepare yourself in the widest possible way, and then when opportunity knocks, you can walk through the door. You can say yes to that opportunity because you never know when it's going to come. I was about to get out of the Army because of my Vietnam injuries and go to graduate school or law school because I couldn't stay in the infantry. And the Army sent a recruiter to where I was serving and said, how'd you like to get a PhD in psychology and stay in the Army? I said, sounds good to me, because I love the Army, and I was a little bit afraid of going out into the civilian world. So I took that opportunity, didn't have a clue as to where it was going to lead me. Went to West Point to be the Director of Psychological Services, and Congress passed a law requiring the admission of women to the service academies, and all the academies resisted that. And then West Point had a major cheating scandal in that same time frame, and I got involved in helping an institution that I love dearly address two really serious issues that almost got West Point closed because we didn't handle it well at first. And before I knew it, I was the chairman of the leadership department, helping the Army reconceptualize leadership after the nation took away the draft, and the Army needed to do that more than anybody else. So you never know, and sometimes it's accidental. You should always have a goal. You should be trying to go somewhere, but be alert for opportunities and things, because sometimes you're forced to make a change. Sometimes something comes along you never even heard of, never thought of, and you say, that sounds cool, I want to go do that instead, and take that risk and make it happen.
Thank you.
All right, final question.
Good afternoon, Mitchum, second class Jarrett, Virginia Tech. This is for either Brigadier General Prince or Colonel McCoy. I know obviously as a leader, you're taught to have equal compassion for all your men. How do you find yourselves dealing with those who aren't willing to help themselves? I'm a firm believer that no one's a lost cause, but at the same time, you really can't waste all your time with the problem kids when you owe it to the rest.
I had a short, sweet rule on that. The question was, if you have those or the ne'er-do-wells, how much energy and time do you spend on them? And my rule was, I'll never quit on a Marine until he quits on me. Was a pretty good rule of thumb. And you will spend as a leader, an inordinate amount of time on those 10%. At the expense of everybody else if you're not careful. But I use that as a general rule, and you give them an opportunity to excel. You try and set them up for success, let them taste success. A lot of these young kids have never had success. They've made it through boot camp, a significant accomplishment, but probably because they were forced. It's amazing what you can do when you're forced, when you don't have a choice. You can do quite a bit. But to be self-starters and to be self-disciplined is what you wanted to create the opportunity for them. So giving them opportunities to excel, let them taste success and what that looks like, and they respond to that positive feedback, then you're in there. But again, at the end of the day, there are some that you're not going to motivate no matter what. What I call, I'm not smart and you can't make me. There is that crowd out there, and you have to cut your losses at some point.
I would agree with that. I think you got to take the high road initially, make the assumption there's something in this person that I can bring out. And all too often we give up too soon. One of my personal heroes is a guy named John Gardner, who wrote, I think, probably the best book on leadership to read. If you've never read it, if you've never read anything on leadership, read John Gardner's book on leadership. And he talks in there about leaders who leave riches left untapped. And he's Californian, so he's referring back to the gold miners who dug into the side of a mountain and they stopped 6 inches away from a vein of gold that was a foot wide. Well, we do the same thing with people. On the other hand, sometimes people do things that are so serious that they're not tolerable. I fired 3 officers in my career, one on the battlefield for incompetence that caused people to die, and I fired 2 officers from the faculty at West Point for lying. At that time, West Point had a single sanction honor code. If you were caught lying, cheating, or stealing and found guilty, you were dismissed. There's no room for an officer in an environment where he's supposed to be serving as a role model to lie in official work and be retained. You just can't do it. And it broke my heart to relieve one of those officers at West Point because he's a good guy. The other guy was an alley cat, and I just didn't know it. And the guy in Vietnam had not been trained for the job he had, and he couldn't do it.
Thank you, John.
All right, we're going to get an announcement about where to go from here, but I hope you'll agree with me. I think our panelists have done a superb job with some really difficult questions, so let's thank them.